Coming up in this episode, we're going to cover the rest of the Sierra SCI games, including Leisure Suit Larry and the Space Quest series, and even Police Quest 4 Open Season. We'll also talk about Roberta Williams continuing to push the adventure game genre forward with King's Quest 6, 7, and Mask of Eternity and Phantasmagoria. We'll cover Jane Jensen's rise to prominence as an adventure game master with the Gabriel Knight games, explore Freddy Pharkas' Frontier Pharmacist and Torrin's Passage, and even touch on the Shivers series as well as the far more obscure Lighthouse, The Dark Being. It's going to be an epic adventure through the 1990s, and I'm happy to take you through it. I'm Sean Jordan, and I am your great game guide. Let's delve back into the golden era of 1990s adventure games you probably have heard of, as well as a few you possibly haven't. As we discussed a few episodes ago, Sierra's reputation for adventure game excellence went well beyond the family-friendly King's Quest, the grounded-in-reality Police Quest, the science-fiction silliness of Space Quest, or the fantasy adventuring of Quest for Glory. In fact, one of Sierra's most popular series, Leisure Suit Larry, was aimed at adults, and while it was far from the only raunchy software out there, Infocom's Leather Goddesses of Phobos, Free Spirit Software's Sex Vixens from Space, Cocktail Vision's Emmanuel, and Megatech Software's Cobra Mission Panic in the Cobra City, Metal and Lace, and Knights of Zentar are just some of the many examples of games released for various computer platforms that didn't require players to put on a trench coat and dark glasses and buy the games in a seedy location in the bad part of town so the neighbors wouldn't see. Leisure Suit Larry was smutty, sure, but it was also relatively tame. In most of the games, you had to work pretty hard to see any actual sex, and the nudity was so pixelated even in the Super VGA games that it wasn't too titillating. I'd argue what made the series so successful was that it was loaded with humor that would make adults laugh out loud, but sail right over the heads of the kids who snuck into their parents' bedrooms to try to play it. Even Larry's continued insistence on wearing a leisure suit was such a dated reference by the 1990s that the subtext of gold medallions, disco dancing, and flop sweat being masked by stinky cologne were all but lost on those who had not lived through the 1970s. Myself included, because I only lived in that decade for a couple of months. We discussed the first Leisure Suit Larry game when we talked about Sierra's original Advanced Game Interpreter, or AGI engine games. But the next two games, released in 1988 and 1989, received an upgrade to the Sierra Creative Interpreter, or SCI Zero engine, for both better graphics and some gameplay enhancement. In fact, if you complete the original Leisure Suit Larry and seduce the final woman, Eve, in the penthouse hot tub, Ken Williams walks on screen after the fireworks go off and tells you about the soon-to-be-released sequel, which he admits they haven't made a name up for yet. But that sequel is actually quite different from the original Night Out and Lost Wages. Leisure Suit Larry goes looking for love in several wrong places, fakes out players with an intro that makes them think Larry Laffer has found a lasting relationship with Eve as he mows her lawn in his trademark leisure suit. She pulls into the driveway and doesn't know who he is, kicking him to the curb and releasing her Scottish Terrier Brutus to stand guard. After he takes a whiz on Larry's leg, with Larry remarking that this dog looks familiar, the game moves on to its actual story, which is kind of a spy or intrigue story? Really? In an odd twist, Larry wins $1 million in the lottery and then also wins a spot on a dating show. And he's accidentally selected as the winner by the empty-headed, but very beautiful, bachelorette Barbara Bimbo. They're supposed to go on an all-expenses-paid month-long cruise aboard the USS Love Tub in the South Pacific. Larry's dumb luck has never been greater. But Barbie turns out to be a little more cunning than her TV appearance suggested. She fakes being sick and sends her horny mother on the trip instead. Larry escapes from the ship and winds up on an island that's crawling with KGB agents. As it happens, Larry accidentally picked up some microfilm they're searching for. Larry eventually evades them by sneaking off the island on a plane, landing on the island of None Tonight, and crossing paths with the evil No Nuki, who's also searching for the microfilm and who's also hypnotized all of the native women to serve him without question. And, by the way, if you're paying attention to those puns, here's another one. This is a virgin island, by which the game literally means all the girls are saving themselves for marriage. And when Larry meets the girl of his dreams, a topless princess named Kalalau, He has to earn the right to marry her by impressing Chief Kenny Wow Wow, a man who looks suspiciously like Ken Williams from the original game. As big of a loser as Larry is, things go right for him in the end. He accidentally kills Dr. No Nuki, frees the island, and gets married to Kalaulau, and we get to see them naked and running on a beach while Larry, feeling younger than ever, gets a happy ending in every sense of the phrase. It doesn't last, though, and we find out why in the third game, Leisure Suit Larry 3, Passionate Patty in pursuit of the pulsating pectorals. 5 years later, the islands become a commercialized tourist trap full of condos and resorts. Chief Kenny Wow Wow is now Chairman Kenneth, and Kalala has realized that she's in love with someone named Bobby, who Larry soon finds out isn't another man, but a woman. She announces that by the customs of the island, they're now divorced. Even worse, Chairman Kenneth fires him since he's no longer part of the family. His pride stung and his job now over, Larry struts around the island in his trademark leisure suit, getting into a series of raunchy misadventures. And in many ways, this game is a return to form because the second game actually penalizes you for flirting with women and tones down a lot of the more overt sexual humor, while this game almost immediately features nudity, sex on the beach, and an enormously gifted statue Larry manages to pawn off on a tourist who loves to spend her money on stupid things. But then there's a curveball, and it's a big one. See, there was this character in the second game named Polyester Patty who was part of Dr. No Nuki's hypnotized harem. 5 years later, she's a jazz pianist performing under the name Passionate Patty, and for some reason, she falls for Larry, but accidentally lets it slip that she's still in a relationship with someone else. While a crestfallen Larry takes off, you take control of Passionate Patty and have to go find him using your feminine wiles and most of your underwear to track him down. The game ends with Larry and Patty being captured by Amazonian lesbian cannibals and imprisoned in a village. Al Lowe must have realized he wrote himself into a corner with this twist because the pair open up the background, literally fall out of the game, and wind up in Coarse Gold, California on the Sierra backlot where games like Space Quest 2, Police Quest, and King's Quest 4 are being made using practical effects and sound stages. Roberta Williams even gets annoyed as Larry and Patty walk on set and ruin a shot of Rosella inside the mouth of a whale. But she's intrigued as Larry tells her he's had some adventures of his own, and he winds up working for Sierra, staying at the Williams Lake house and coding his adventures in lost wages into a computer while a topless Patty sits beside him. Once again, Larry gets a happy ending as he turns from his former software salesman into a software developer. And there's even a fan theory that he's coding the SCI-1 remake of his first adventure, which debuted in 1991 using King's Quest V's SCI-1 engine icon system and featuring far more stunning 256-color VGA graphics with more alluring portraits of all of the girls from his first adventure. And the remake also looks quite similar in style to the over-the-top cartoonishness of Leisure Suit Larry 5, Passionate Patty Does a Little Undercover Work, released the same year. Before you ask, no, there is no Leisure Suit Larry 4. Like I said, Al Lowe knew he'd written himself into a corner and recognized it was far funnier to make the missing floppies for the fourth game a running joke and a plot point in the fifth one. He's also said at different points that there was a fourth game in the works for the online service The Sierra Network and it never came to be. Either way, the absence of Leisure Suit Larry 4 became one of the longest running jokes in adventure gaming, and the series refers to it constantly. And Leisure Suit Larry 5 advances the story to a point where Larry has amnesia because of the missing floppy disks from the fourth game, and he's working for an adult films producer and is sent out to record secret footage of 3 women who are going to appear on television on America's Sexiest Home Videos. Meanwhile, Passionate Patty is working for the FBI as an undercover agent investigating the music industry. Their 2 independent adventures eventually dovetail and bring them together as national heroes as they meet President George H.W. Bush and have dinner at the White House. Leisure Suit Larry 5 marks a high point for the series because it's the first game in which neither Larry nor Patty can die, and there's also no way to find yourself in an unwinnable situation. The game's really more about humorous storytelling than puzzle solving. As such, it's a great game to play if you just want to check the series out, because it fits the modern sensibilities of what point-and-click adventure games are far better than the earlier text-driven titles. I wish I could say the same for the next game, 1993's Leisure Suit Larry 6, Shape Up or Slip Out. It's fairly easy, but it's also a return to some of the earlier ideas of the series, like cheap deaths and goofy inventory-based puzzles. Passionate Patty is nowhere to be seen, and there are no other characters to play as besides Larry. It also has a rather jarring visual style because Larry himself continues to look like a cartoon character, but the girls and environments look more realistic, as if they were digitized from photos and paintings. But more than anything, the formula just starts to feel a little tired, and the addition of Super VGA graphics and voice acting don't help with that. Though I will say Sierra at least hired professional voice actors instead of whomever was in the office that day. Leisure Suit Larry 7, Love for Sale, debuted in 1996 and takes a completely different approach, depicting everything in the luscious animation style similar to Ralph Bakshi's smutty 1992 film Cool World. If you've seen that movie, its inspiration is clear, right down to naming all the female characters after celebrities with sex puns for names like Drew Barrymore and Jamie Lee Curtis and Do Me More. If you want to play a saucy cartoon show, this is your game. But this is also where the series feels like it's straining its premise to its limits. What's more, it ends up with a post-credits scene where the cruise ship on which the game takes place gets abducted by aliens, while Larry's in the middle of some truly nasty cartoon sex with the voluptuous Captain Thigh. Thank goodness we never got Leisure Suit Larry Explores Uranus, one of the proposed titles for the game, which was apparently in development as a full 3D adventure. Ugh. But the creative mind behind the Leisure Suit Larry games did make a couple more that I think are much better. A Wild West comedy in the style of Blazing Saddles, and an animated adventure game that feels like a spiritual sequel to The Black Cauldron. So Al Lowe is a pretty funny guy, and if you ever hear him in interviews, he comes across as one of those people who likes to laugh as much as he likes to make other people laugh. So it's no surprise that when he got a little bored with the Leisure Suit Larry shtick, he turned to some classic sources of humorous inspiration and decided he'd really like to do something set in the Old West in the style of Mel Brooks's Blazing Saddles. After making a pitch to Roberta Williams that included accidentally saying the word pharmacist, he realized that a pharmacist might make for a great adventure game character. And so he partnered with Josh Mandel and wrote a lengthy backstory for his new character. They turned into an introductory ballad you get to hear in the game about a retired gunslinger with a silver ear, a high SAT score, and a penchant for pharmacology. And I won't torture you with my singing again, I promise. But I will say that this ballad is the perfect way to kick off Freddy Pharkas' Frontier Pharmacist, one of the funniest and most fun adventure games I've ever played. The story opens in Coarse-Gold, California, where Freddy is running a pharmacy but is also troubleshooting various problems like overly flatulent horses, diarrhea outbreaks, and a snail stampede, often using his knowledge of chemistry. Playing on old Western tropes, Freddy has an Indian sidekick, East Indian as in from India, and also a school teacher love interest named Penelope Prim. And of course, he has an arch rival, Kenny the Kid, a caricature of Ken Williams, who was the outlaw responsible for shooting off Freddy's ear. There's even a cameo from Leisure Suit Larry's grandpappy, and several other nods to Sierra games. Because graphical adventure games aren't great at being action games, but are wonderful at having gamers solve puzzles, the setup for Freddy Pharkas is actually quite brilliant. The game forces you to spend time mixing together concoctions and is able to introduce real danger without allowing Freddy to just pull out a gun to solve his problems. And even when Freddy does return to gunslinging and gets a rematch later in the game, it doesn't go well, and he still has to use his wits to survive the final act's surprising twists and turns. If you play the game today, chances are good you'll be playing the CD-ROM Talkie Edition, and it's a great version because it includes voice acting from some seasoned pros like Cam Clark, Kath Soucie, Louis Arquette, Michael Gow, Neil Ross, Susan Silo, and Nicholas Guest, among others. Al Lowe himself performed the musical numbers at the beginning and end of the game, but the Talkie Edition is actually inferior to the original disc-based version in terms of the actual script for the game, and some of the gags and hints are removed from the CD-ROM edition. The year after Freddy Pharkas debuted, Al Lowe worked on a very different game called Torrin's Passage, this time designed to be a family-friendly affair that had plenty of cartoon gags for the little ones and some wink and nod jokes for the adults. The animation in the game is probably its standout feature, and with good reason. James G. Murphy designed the characters before leaving Sierra for Pixar to become a lead animator there, and he partnered with Sierra's talented animation director Al Eufrasio, who had also worked on games like Leisure Suit Larry Love for Sale, Space Quest 6, and King's Quest 7. Torrin's Passage reminds me a lot of Al Lowe's earlier 1980s Disney games for Sierra, including The Black Cauldron and Winnie the Pooh and the 100-Acre Wood, which he designed and programmed, as well as Mickey's Space Adventure, which Roberta Williams designed and for which Al Lowe composed the music. While it's far more sophisticated and obviously a lot better looking than any of these games, featuring lavish animation, an icon-driven interface, and a deeper storyline, it still has a simplicity to it that really seems to be more focused on telling an entertaining story than providing a tough adventure. That's not to say there aren't some puzzles that need solving, and I suspect the game was probably a bit too much for younger children in that regard. But as Sierra games go, the puzzles are at least straightforward and don't require too much lateral thinking, and the game has a built-in hint system. Whenever I play Torrin's Passage, I tend to think of the 1983 Laserdisc game Dragon's Lair, because this game's animation style is cut from the same cloth as Don Bluth's lavish fantasy adventure. Torrin is an extremely well-animated, blonde-haired young man with a purple and green pet named Boogle, who follows him around and helps him solve puzzles. Many of the characters in the game look like they're straight out of a Saturday morning cartoon show, and the interesting series of worlds in which the game takes place, which consists of 5 different realms nested within each other, add a lot of variety to the gameplay. If you've missed this one, you should definitely play it. But as fun as Torrin's Passage is, it never quite achieved the same status of some of Sierra's other games, and this may be because the game's box art shows a bunch of crystals on the front instead of selling the kid-friendly, cartoony vibe. And it may also be because Al Lowe's name was so synonymous with smut that adults were hesitant to try to play the game with their kids. It exists in a weird place then, not quite childish enough for children, not quite adult enough for grown-ups, and not marketed well enough to crowd the family around a computer to play together. It might have done better as a console game for a system like the PlayStation, but Sierra never really got into making those. And that's a real shame, because after King's Quest V got a port to the NES, Sierra missed a big opportunity to port the next 3 King's Quest games to a multimedia console, where they would have likely found a wider audience. The 1992 sequel King's Quest VI, Air Today, Gone Tomorrow, would have made a great console game on a platform like the 3DO or the Sega CD because it utilized a more streamlined approach to King's Quest V's point-and-click icon-based system. It's also, of all the King's Quest games, probably the best known for its storytelling, and this has a lot to do with the fact that Roberta Williams partnered with an up-and-coming writer at Sierra named Jane Jensen. The storyline in King's Quest VI picks up right after King's Quest V and involves Prince Alexander striking out for the land of the Green Isles to find Princess Cassima, whom he discovers is being forced to marry the evil Vizier Abdul al-Hazred, who's running the kingdom now. If this sounds a little like the 1989 game Prince of Persia setup, or even like Disney's Aladdin, which came out in 1992, yep, the whole Arabian Nights motif was having a moment during that time, and remember that Sierra had also made Conquest of Camelot and Quest for Glory 2, Trial by Fire prior to this game, both of which also featured Middle Eastern settings. But the further you get into King's Quest VI, the more it abandons this setting in favor of some other traditions like Alice in Wonderland, Greek mythology, and European fairy tales, and this patchwork approach to fantasy is actually to the game's benefit because it helps the story to feel more structured. One of the most interesting aspects of King's Quest VI is that the production team used motion capture of filmed, costumed actors as reference for the game's sprites and animations. The backgrounds are also hand-painted and quite visually lush. The result is one of the best-looking point-and-click adventure games of the era, and the 1993 CD-ROM version is even better thanks to professional voice acting and a rendered introductory sequence video. Sierra even followed Disney's lead and released a soft rock power ballad single called Girl in a Tower that they tried to get played on radio stations by encouraging fans to call in and request it. By today's standards, it's totally cheesy, but this was a pretty bold move for a game publisher in the 1990s and yet another great example of how Sierra thought outside the box. As Jane Jensen went on to work on her more famous Sierra game, Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers, Roberta Williams took further inspiration from Disney and decided to make her next King's Quest game in the style of the animated films Disney was producing at the time, complete with musical numbers. And so, King's Quest VII, The Princeless Bride, upped the production as it brought back Princess Rosella and her mother, Queen Valenice, to star in a game together. The result was a game that was both visually stunning for its time, but also not quite sophisticated enough to resemble the Disney films it was imitating. Much like Torrin's Passage, the animation has more of a Don Bluth characteristic to it, But because Queen Valenice is a little too regal for cartoon antics and Rosella is drawn like a Disney princess, the cartoony fun doesn't translate to the characters quite as well as it does for Torrin. Even so, the animation is well implemented in many places. Early in the game, Rosella gets transformed into a troll, and this actually allows for a lot more slapstick and exaggeration, which are far better suited to the animation style. And the villainous Enchantress Militia is perfect for this game, since animation allows her swirling robes and magical abilities to make her look quite fearsome and dynamic. Valenice also encounters many characters who are depicted beautifully in animation, such as the Fates, a headless horseman, a city of trolls, a ghostly horse, the goddess Ceres, and King Oberon and Queen Titania. And that last couple of names, another power couple this time from mythology, ought to tip you off that King's Quest VII is not just steeped in fairy tales, but literally is one, complete with the handsome prince and the true love's kiss at the end. That is, of course, assuming you don't get the bad ending where the prince dies. But King's Quest VII is also a logical conclusion to the series, both in terms of the story it's telling and the way it evolves the gameplay to use a contextual cursor and a graphic interface that shows inventory items along the bottom of the screen. There are chapters and checkpoints and screens that actually pan as you move rather than staying static. And, curiously, King Graham never makes an appearance. This is truly Rosella and Valenice's story to tell, providing an exciting epilogue to everything that's come before it. Unfortunately, it's not the last King's Quest game in the original series, though it is the last to feature Graham's royal families as playable characters. In the 1998 Love It or Hate It game King's Quest Mask of Eternity, Sierra decided to render the adventure in full 3D using a game engine Dynamics had originally built for the Red Baron flight sims. I'll give Roberta Williams some credit. This game was ambitious, and the transition to 3D is very different from what you see in games like Grim Fandango or Escape from Monkey Island, because Mask of Eternity plays more like a 3D action RPG with a clunky point-and-click interface than a traditional fixed-camera point-and-click adventure. There's even a first-person perspective mode and a combat system. I don't really want to get into the story of this one because it's about a brand new character named Connor who's a peasant, but somehow also a knight of Daventry who's forced to save the kingdom from an evil magician. And I guess that's kind of Graham's origin story too, but it somehow feels a lot less believable in a more sophisticated game from the late 1990s. Anyhow, Connor has to restore the Mask of Eternity, which is broken by an archon named Lucreto at the beginning of the game and turns everyone to stone. There are some really heavy biblical undertones to this story that are kind of out of place for a King's Quest game. Lucreto is basically Lucifer, and there's an altar in a place called Paradise Lost, and Connor basically equips himself with spiritual armor and a fiery sword, and even gains immortality from a stand-in for the Holy Grail. I'm guessing this was more about Roberta Williams pulling ideas from European medieval folklore than anything evangelical, but it all strikes a different tone from the normal King's Quest games, especially since the game plays so differently. There are conflicting reports about how successful Mask of Eternity was as a game, but I remember it being quite polarizing among people who actually played it. The low poly models, janky combat, and aggravating camera definitely make it hard to love today, and given that it has almost nothing to do with the other games in the series besides some superficial connections, I'd suggest skipping it, though I do recommend the game's soundtrack, which even inspired a musical sequel multi-movement composition by Donald M. Wilson called the Daventry Suite, which Sierra touted as the first musical work of extended scope to be inspired by a computer game. I'm not sure if that's actually true. Japan has a long tradition of audio dramas and rearrangements and covers and such to accompany its games, but it's definitely interesting. I unfortunately haven't been able to find a recording of it, though. Those who want a more traditional King's Quest sequel might enjoy the fan game The Silver Lining by Phoenix Online Studios, which currently has 4 of its 5 parts available online for free, though I wouldn't hold out for that final part since it's been over 15 years since Part 4 came out. But if you love the earlier King's Quest games, you'll enjoy seeing the game open with Rosella and Edgar's wedding as they convene in the land of the Green Isles alongside Alexander and Cassima, as well as King Graham and Queen Valenice. Unfortunately, tragedy strikes, and the game allows you to play as King Graham, who dons his traditional adventurer's garb and tries to find a way to revive his children, who have been cursed into a magical coma. For a fan game, it's really well done, complete with voice acting and cinematics as well as some great music. Activision also produced a remake of King's Quest released in 2015 as an episodic adventure game. This game has no involvement from Roberta Williams and was developed by The Odd Gentleman, an indie game developer behind games you've probably never heard of like The Misadventures of P.B. Winterbottom, Slap Happy Sam, Wayward Manor, and Flea Symphony. This reboot takes a lot of liberties with the original canon and reinterprets the stories of King's Quest's first, second, third, and fifth games. It's a good and interesting take on the material written by The Odd Gentleman's Matt Korba and Lindsay Rostel, but I'm unsure of who it's really for. It's a little too referential to the original series for new fans, and a little too different for existing fans to fully sink into. But if you want to hear Christopher Lloyd and Josh Keaton take turns playing Graham, and other familiar voice actors like Wallace Shawn, Fred Tatasciore, Kath Soucie, Zelda Williams, Kevin Michael Richardson, and Tom Kenny playing roles in a King's Quest game, this is the one for you. I think it's clear that Sierra had a profound influence on me as a gamer in the 1990s, but so did a show running on TV at the time that has since become a comedy classic, The Simpsons, which was still in its golden years then. In one episode, the animation studio behind Itchy and Scratchy decides to introduce a new character, Poochie, who sucks up so much energy in his debut that Bart's friend Milhouse grows agitated and starts asking, "When are they gonna get to the fireworks factory?" If you're feeling that way now, knowing that we still have some pretty incredible Sierra games to cover, you can rest easy, because it's finally time to talk about Space Quest IV, Roger Wilco and the Time Rippers, one of my favorite games of all time, and definitely my favorite Sierra game, especially in its CD-ROM Talkie edition. If you recall from one of our earlier episodes, Space Quest III ends with Roger Wilco dropping off the two guys from Andromeda with Ken Williams to work at Sierra while he returns to space for more adventures. And like Al Lowe with the Leisure Suit Larry series, creators Scott Murphy and Mark Crow had more or less written themselves into a corner with that ending. And so, Space Quest IV opens with a scene where Roger is sitting in a bar, regaling the patrons with his adventures, when two robot members of the Time Police, armed with rifles and clad in fascist-friendly black outfits, storm inside and arrest him. They reveal that they've been sent by Sludge Vohal, the enemy from Space Quest II, Vohal's Revenge, and that they're there to kill Roger and prevent him from stopping Vohal's domination of the universe. But before they can execute him, a group of freedom fighters called the Time Rippers save Roger and send him through a time portal. He wakes up in Space Quest XII, Vohal's Revenge 2, and discovers that he has to steal a time machine from the Time Police and travel through time to find a way to stop Vohal's return. If you can't already guess, the game's full of meta-style jokes as Roger journeys to other games in his timeline like Space Quest X, Latex Babes of Estros, and even Space Quest I, the Sarian encounter, in its original AGI glory. And you never actually get to play as him in Space Quest IV. That game only appears in the intro and in the credits. Beyond being hysterically funny in places and offering strange diversions like going to the mall, working at Monolith Burger, and playing the arcade game Mrs. Astro Chicken, Space Quest IV's Talkie Edition is perhaps best known for its narration by Gary Owens, the famous announcer from the classic comedy show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In and many other radio and television programs, including voicing the original iteration of Hanna-Barbera's Space Ghost. Sierra had many of its own staff provide the voices of characters in the game, but the cheesy voice acting only adds considerable charm since Space Quest IV plays it all for laughs. It's strange then that Space Quest V, The Next Mutation, never got a talkie version. Part of this might be because Sierra delegated the development to the financially troubled Dynamics, with Mark Crow leading the team minus Scott Murphy. In this game, Roger applies to StarCon Academy hoping to become a starship captain in the mold of Star Trek. But after he cheats his way through his exams, his dreams are somewhat tempered when he's given command of a garbage scow called the SCS Eureka. As Space Quest games go, it's actually one of the funniest of the bunch, really mining all the Star Trek humor and also giving Roger a pet facehugger like you might see in Aliens. It also advances one of the plot twists from Space Quest IV, introducing Roger to Beatrice, the buxom blonde woman whom he's been told will one day be his wife, though this plotline is entirely dropped in the next game. And if you play Space Quest 6, The Spinal Frontier, immediately after you finish Part 5, you may even find it a little frustrating because the game essentially resets the plot by demoting Roger back to the status of space janitor and introducing a new love interest named Stellar Santiago, a character whom Roger ultimately has to enter in a miniaturized form to destroy some evil nanobots. Santiago is a definite downgrade from Beatrice's love interests go. She has no charisma as a character and plays a fairly insignificant role in the story despite her body serving as a plot device. But this is also because Space Quest 6 in general isn't nearly as funny as the previous games, which is a shame because it's probably the best looking graphically thanks to a cartoony style, Super VGA graphics, and lots of sight gags involving crazy aliens and hidden references. It also has a stronger voice cast of professional actors this time around, with Gary Owens returning to narrate. Behind the scenes, what happened was that Scott Murphy and Mark Crow had parted ways as development partners, and while Mark Crow was at Dynamics in Eugene, Oregon, Murphy remained at Sierra's Oakhurst facility, but he was busy working on Police Quest Open Season when Sierra decided to begin development on Space Quest 6. Josh Mandel took over as the lead designer, and Scott Murphy was placed in a consulting role. But then Josh Mandel left Sierra as things began deteriorating there, and Scott Murphy had to finish the game. I want to add that Scott Murphy has always come across as a terribly nice guy, as has Josh Mandel, and I suspect the issue with Space Quest 6 was less about Mark Crow's lack of involvement and more about the game just not quite coming together creatively due to all the internal friction at Sierra. Scott Murphy has described Space Quest 6 as an abortion in an infamously candid 2006 interview he gave to Adventure Classic Gaming, and also said in the same interview that his friend and Sierra co-worker Doug Oldfield contributed a lot to the humor of the series without much credit. He also indicates that Sierra colleague Leslie Balfour helped him out a lot during the final years, including during his fruitless time spent working on Space Quest 7 before the infamous Chainsaw Monday event in 1999 that resulted in most of Sierra's staff being fired. I think that part of what helped Scott Murphy and Mark Crow have such a fruitful partnership on their first 4 games was the fact that they were creating the games they wanted to play while working in an increasing pressure cooker at Sierra, in which their creative input was not nearly as important to Ken Williams as his business interests. They were also getting a chance to work on the Space Quest games as a respite from their other assignments, which they clearly weren't as passionate about. As they grew apart, they lost their ability to find that common ground. In fact, when the two guys from Andromeda got back together in 2012 to work on their Kickstarter game Space Venture, their partnership became strained again, and the game ultimately took 13 years to finally see release. Full disclosure, by the way, I was a backer on that project, and let's just say I'm glad they finally got it finished so we can put an end to that whole saga. But as we close out talking about Space Quest, I want to mention that one thing that's come across in many ex-Sierra employee interviews is how Ken Williams and the Sierra management often treated their intellectual properties outside of Roberta Williams' projects as second-rate and less worthy of investment and promotion. Ken's dream was never to run a thriving game developer. It was to make a lot of money. This is something that's parodied all the time in Sierra's games, similar to the way that Saturday Night Live alums love to heckle Lorne Michaels. I've also mentioned before that Ken Williams often comes across as someone who made business decisions that didn't make a lot of sense to his staff, and one of the series where things really got out of control was Police Quest. Police Quest Open Season, also known as Police Quest 4, was made after retired California Highway Patrol officer Jim Walls departed from Sierra in 1991. I've never seen a published reason why Jim Walls left, but it seems to be a situation where he felt it was the right thing to do. And so Ken Williams saw the opportunity to put the name of a different police consultant on the box. To the chagrin of many of his employees, he chose Daryl F. Gates, the former LAPD police chief who'd been in charge during the 1991 riots that led to the savage beating of Rodney King, a black motorist. The violence was videotaped and broadcast around the world, leading to a major scandal that took Gates and many other police officers in the LAP down. But I don't want to suggest Daryl Gates was a victim of circumstance. There are few figures in policing who are more controversial or impactful. He was a reactionary leader who helped transform policing into what it is today, greatly expanding the police force, establishing the first SWAT team, running the extremely controversial and racist Operation Hammer in the 1980s, creating gang infiltration units called Crash that were frequently accused of illegal tactics and racial profiling, and also helping to create the frankly useless DARE program to further sow hysteria and fear about the war on drugs. And that's just the short list. Suffice it to say that by 1992, when Ken Williams decided to bring Daryl Gates on and publicize his role at Sierra, he was one of the most polarizing people in the state of California. And his name was not only emblazoned on the box for Police Quest Open Season and the publicity materials, but Gates himself appears as a character in the game. I really don't have much to say about this title as an adventure game. It's a step down from Police Quest 3 in design, set in LA instead of the fictional town of Lytton, and featuring digitized graphics and full motion video instead of the painted and animated graphics of the earlier games. It has some tremendously hammy acting, homophobia and transphobia, a literal Nazi as a character, and absolutely racist portrayals of Korean convenience store owners who speak in broken English, and what the game portrays as no good black people from the ghetto who are always criminals and speak in the caricature of street speak once known as Ebonics. There is a word I have not thought about in 30 years. I don't want to suggest the other Police Quest games were any better in this way, and they all have their cringy moments, but here's the thing. Even Daryl Gates, perhaps realizing how bad the optics were, given his reputation for oppressing communities of color, distanced himself from the worst elements of Open Season and blamed it on Sierra's writers, which meant that much of the blame for the game's worst elements were shifted to Tammy Dargan, the director and chief writer for the game, and a former producer for America's Most Wanted. She, in turn, in a 1994 article in Vibe magazine, blamed the script on her purported reference guide for how black people talked in the 1990s, Fab Five Freddy's Rap Dictionary Fresh Fly Flavor, a claim to which I'm sure Fab Five Freddy raised an eyebrow. Cultural racism is a shameful, shameful thing. Now, some people say the criticisms of the racism in Police Quest Open Season are overblown, so you know what? I'll leave it to you to decide for yourself. But this was the last adventure game in the series. The next 4 Police Quest games were spin-offs based around SWAT teams and included an FMV simulator, an isometric tactical strategy game, and 2 Rainbow Six-style tactical shooters. These games definitely fit Daryl Gates' reputation for representing the police as a force that needed to use paramilitary-style violence to keep the streets safe, and while I do like the 3rd and 4th game as tactical shooters, they're still problematic for advancing the idea that the police need to be armed like soldiers and ready to shoot to kill the moment they see a gun. So now that we've descended into the darkness, we might as well continue with Sierra's actual line of paranormal and horror adventure games. I've name-checked Jane Jensen quite a bit in this episode, but let's give her a proper introduction now with the game she's best known for creating, 1993's Gabriel Knight Sins of the Fathers. And I don't think I'm going too far in saying this is considered to be one of the best, if not the best, of all of Sierra's adventure games, and perhaps even for the entire point-and-click genre. At the time, it was only a modest seller, but over time, it's developed a reputation for being one of the greatest horror games ever made, as well as for having one of the best voice casts of all time in its CD-ROM edition, with well-known actors Tim Curry, Leah Remini, Mark Hamill, Michael Dorn all playing major roles alongside a number of talented voice actors and character actors. The premise of the game is that Gabriel Knight is a horror novelist and bookstore owner in New Orleans who starts investigating a series of serial killings that are called the Voodoo Murders. Gabriel's friend, Detective Frank Mosley, thinks the voodoo stuff is all hype, but Gabriel believes there's something more to it, and along with his loyal assistant Grace Nakamura, he investigates further and starts talking to local voodoo experts. When one of those experts winds up dead, Gabriel finds himself on the actual trail of a supernatural killer who has a mysterious connection to the past and to Gabriel's ancestors. I don't want to spoil any of the plot because I want you to play this game. But suffice it to say that this game winds up going deep into exploring the occult, the mythology around the practice of voodoo, and a secret society of supernatural hunters known as Schottenjägers, or Shadow Hunters, who protect the material world from the evil forces of the spiritual one. And though Jane Jensen has cited the 1987 movie Angel Heart as an inspiration for the game, The game goes well beyond that premise and reflects not just a great adventure, but a fantastic story told well through the conventions of adventure gaming. The gameplay itself is typical illustrated point-and-click adventure game fare, but it has a distinctive look and feel due to many scenes that are shown at isometric angles or in comic book style cutscenes. The game was known for its gory sequences and voodoo rituals, and if there had been an ESRB rating system then, it would have been rated M for certain. The 1995 sequel, The Beast Within, a Gabriel Knight mystery, is a completely different creature because it's done in a multimedia style with actual sets and digitized actors, making it look much more like the Tex Murphy games. The story moves to Munich, Germany, where Gabriel is studying his heritage. When a little girl is murdered by a wolf, Gabriel's asked to investigate if it actually might be a werewolf, and he contacts Grace in New Orleans and asks her to join him on a new investigation. During the game, you get to play as both characters, this time played by on-screen actors who supply their own voices and animations. While this significant change in style, setting, and plot might sound like the makings of a disaster, the sequel is regarded by most fans as being just as good as the original, if not even better. I personally prefer the first game, but it's Jane Jensen's strong writing and design that ensure both games are truly great. And did I mention that her husband, Robert Holmes, wrote the music for these games? That's right, they're yet another power couple from Sierra, and they've since partnered on some other games Jane Jensen has made, like Gray Matter and Mobius Empire Rising. The duo also worked together on the third Gabriel Knight game, Blood of the Sacred, Blood of the Damned, released in 1999, and this one is notable not only for being a full 3D game built in a custom 3D engine, but also bringing back Tim Curry as the voice of Gabriel Knight, though he sounds a lot less excited to be here in this installment. Though the other characters from the first game have new voice actors, this is yet another top-notch slate of voice actors and character actors who bring the game to life. Not that Gabriel Knight 3 needs it. This is the rare adventure game that survives the transition to 3D and which elevates not just the storytelling, but the puzzle solving by getting past the constraints of the more traditional SCI-style games. One of the most famous elements of the game is the Le Serpent Rouge puzzle, which involves a poem broken into 14 segments. Grace Nakamura has to decipher riddles within this poem and then solve additional puzzles that are revealed through solutions and additional information. It reminds me a lot of the Macintosh classic puzzle game The Fool's Errand, which also uses interlocking Zodiac-themed puzzles to reveal bigger and better mysteries. And I'd love to see more modern adventure games apply this level of depth, complexity, and puzzle-solving satisfaction. Unfortunately, Gabriel Knight 3 was also the final adventure game from Sierra, and it's often considered a swan song for the genre, since adventure games pretty much died in the years that followed. As we know, 2.5 decades later, the point-and-click adventure has made a pretty incredible comeback, but at the time, the game was seen as one of the best last gasps of a dying era. So, with Jane Jensen as the shining star of Sierra in the late 1990s, you might wonder what happened to Roberta Williams when she wasn't working on King's Quest. The answer is that she'd returned to the roots of where it all began for her career as an adventure game designer, by having players venture into yet another house filled with mystery. This time, the game was called Phantasmagoria, a multimedia game spanning 7 CDs and featuring footage compiled from dozens of hours of recordings captured over several months in front of a blue screen, which is one of the reasons the game looks so phony and unbelievable compared to its sequel, which was filmed on actual sets. I want to mention before we start talking about these games that I am not a fan of Phantasmagoria for a very simple reason. It's incredibly boring, punctuated with lots of terrible comedy and cheesy excuses for horror. Imagine playing a point-and-click adventure game where you spend 90% of your time walking around and looking at things in a giant empty house while spooky soap opera music is playing, but nothing actually happens. And that's pretty much what you get with this game. Groundbreaking for its time? Sure. But fun to play today? I really wouldn't recommend it. The premise of Phantasmagoria is that a mystery novelist named Adrienne Delaney and her photographer husband Don Gordon move into an abandoned mansion in New England that was once owned by a magician named Zoltan Karnavash, known by his stage name of Carno. In the introduction, Adrienne has a nightmare filled with horrific torture devices and wakes up in bed with her husband, who consoles her and has sex with her. You might think this is going to set the tone for an interesting adult-oriented game, but no! Adrian is going to spend a good chunk of the game just wandering around and pining for Dawn, who decides he's going to set up a darkroom photo lab in one area of the mansion. And Dawn. Oh, he's just this unlikable guy from start to finish. At first, sort of seeming like an empty-headed companion who will just kind of be self-interested, but gradually getting crazier and crazier the longer the game goes on, eventually going full-on Joker in the game's final act. It's not his fault. It turns out he's under the influence of a demon sealed away in the mansion that Carno once summoned with black magic because, a stage magician would totally be practicing actual magic and not just performing stage illusions. But it turns out Carno murdered all 5 of his wives when he was alive, and as Adrian begins seeing visions of each of them, she'll stumble across some rather silly and unconvincing horror sequences where she sees how each wife met their end in some silly, contrived way, like being force-fed entrails through a funnel. There's also a famous scene where she's laying on a bed and a bunch of hands reach up out of the mattress to grab her. One of the few effects in the game that actually looks like it was done practically, but which is also sort of silly. The big conceit of Phantasmagoria was that it was going to show the way to a brand new fusion of Hollywood filmmaking and adventure gaming. Unfortunately, the game's just so limited in so many ways that it doesn't really work in execution as well as it should. For example, though the story takes place across multiple days, Adrian is always wearing the same outfit unless she's in a self-contained cutscene. Why? Because Roberta Williams designed the game so that Adrian could wander around the mansion in a non-linear way, which would have made different outfits impractical on a digitized sprite. Another problem is that the mansion and area around it is mostly made up of pre-rendered backgrounds that are lit differently than the blue screen actors, so Adrian's movements through the mansion don't look remotely believable. And then there's the fact that the camera is constantly switching perspectives to suit what could be filmed, making a lot of the movement jarring. Compared to some of the other point-and-click style games of the era that used digitized actors and pre-rendered scenery like The Seventh Guest and Tex Murphy and Blade Runner and heck, even Gabriel Knight 2, Phantasmagoria just feels like an awkward evolutionary dead end in the genre. Most games that wanted to do what this one does would wind up doing it in 3D. And for those that wanted to continue to use full motion video, the 1996 sequel, Phantasmagoria: A Puzzle of Flesh, did everything much better, which is not a compliment to Roberta Williams since she was not involved in its design. In fact, it was designed by Lorelei Shannon, a longtime Sierra writer who'd largely worked in the background at Sierra as a writer and designer, but who's since become known for her horror novels and short stories. Okay, so let me say here that I am not necessarily in line with other adventure game fans when I say Phantasmagoria's sequel is the better game, because it's more of an interactive movie with some light point-and-click elements than it is a true point-and-click adventure. But let me tick off the list of why I like it better. The story is much better written and actually goes into the dark psychological themes that help shape a good adult-oriented horror story. The game has a far more mature outlook on sexuality, including an entire sequence set in a BDSM club, as well as characters who are openly gay, bisexual, or polyamorous. The acting is actually decent, and while I'd say it's more cable TV or VHS horror film than feature film quality, the actors still do a good job of creating believable characters. The twists in the story are actual pull the rug out from under you twists that materially change your understanding of the game and its characters. The tone of the story is far less Stephen King's The Shining and much more in line with the unsettling extra-dimensional horror, open sexuality, and body mutilation of Clive Barker, who Lorelei Shannon cited as an influence. I won't say a lot about the story itself beyond the fact that you start off as a corporate office worker named Curtis Craig who is very uncomfortable in his own skin and who's regularly having strange visions or seeing odd things. Curtis has to navigate an office romance while he sees another coworker on the side, make sense of bizarre emails he's receiving, and deal with the fallout of the mysterious death of an unlikable colleague who was killed in Curtis's cubicle. I will say that the game finishes in a very different place than it starts, and if you can see it through to the end, not an easy feat because it explores a lot of topics related to trauma and exploitation, so shocking it was censored in some parts of the world, you will be surprised where the story takes you. The puzzle of flesh hinted at by the title is pretty much unguessable. I dare you to play the game to the end to find out what it's really about. Provided that you're 18, of course. This game's about as hard of an M rating as anything I've ever played. I want to mention briefly 3 other adventure games Sierra published in the 1990s that really don't get much attention. The first 2 are Shivers and its sequel, Shivers 2: Harvest of Souls. Both games are in the style of Myst or The Seventh Guest and played in the first-person perspective as an unnamed protagonist. Both are also heavy on puzzles and atmosphere, and both are also fairly non-linear in terms of how you play through them. Surprisingly, this series was also built in Sierra's SCI engine, despite feeling quite different from just about every other game built in it, aside from Phantasmagoria 2. I also want to mention both Shivers games have interesting music. The first game has one of the most unsettling scores I've ever come across in an adventure game, written by Guy Whitmore, and the second one has more of that, but also includes a set of gothic hard rock style songs by a fictional band called Trip Cyclone that are good enough to listen to without even playing the games. Though you absolutely should, because both Shivers games are decent adventures if you enjoy paranoia and puzzle solving in equal measure. The other game I wanted to mention is the 1996 release Lighthouse: The Dark Being, another spooky first-person adventure in the style of Myst. It's definitely not a top-tier title. The graphics have that mid-1990s pre-rendered look, and the story is mostly told through notes, and the puzzles are often of the object and lever manipulation variety. But I actually think it has a decent setup and story about a scientist who accidentally opens a portal to a pocket universe that's a reflection of our own, and which has an interdimensional traveler known as a dark being within it. For reasons the game eventually explains, the dark being has come into our world to kidnap the scientist's baby daughter Amanda. It's up to you, as a neighbor who stumbles in on all of this, to head into the parallel dimension and set things right. As a Myst clone, it's a perfectly acceptable game, and it feels like it was Sierra's attempt to try to break into that market just in case their other more ambitious adventure games didn't pay off. The game was designed by John Bach, who'd worked on many Sierra games in the 1990s as an artist and animator, and it honestly shows a lot of good design sensibilities in terms of its atmosphere, environmental design, and mechanical creations you encounter. There's even a sequence where you get to fly in a glider and another where you get to drive a train car. The game even has multiple endings that I'm sure very few people saw, because the downside, more than anything, is the absurd difficulty, which was so bad Sierra had to issue several patches to make it easier. If you get a chance to play this one, give it a shot. It's not so bad with a walkthrough, and I think it's a better game than people gave it credit for at the time. Beyond Sierra's horror games, there was some true horror going on behind the scenes as well, as Ken Williams got scammed by a sale in 1996 to Walter Forbes' CUC International under the false promises that Forbes was creating a super publisher that would include LucasArts, Broderbund, and Blizzard Entertainment's owners, the educational software company Davidson and Associates. In the end, only Davidson was part of the deal, and management strife between the two units ultimately led to the Williamses losing control of their company. Despite the fact that Sierra had some strong publishing plays, including the release of Valve's Half-Life in 1997, Homeworld in 1999, and the late 1990s online gaming platform One.net, for which I wrote some paid freelance articles way back in the day, Sierra ultimately turned into a publishing label, got acquired by a new conglomerate called Vivendi Universal, and struggled for years despite some successes before closing down operations in 2004 and becoming little more than a publishing brand name from that point forward. Their brand IPs ultimately wound up under Activision Blizzard in 2008, and now those IPs that didn't get sold off during that acquisition are owned by Activision Blizzard's new owner, Microsoft. But there were a few other pillars of Sierra's 1990s output that we haven't covered yet, including Sierra's educational discovery line. There's also Dynamics, which created adventure games like The Adventures of Willy Beamish, Rise of the Dragon, and Heart of China. And the other is Cocktail Vision, the creators of the Goblins games, the Inca games, and several adventures by Muriel Tramy, the French Roberta Williams, which include The Bizarre Adventure of Woodruff and the Schnibble, Lost in Time, and Urban Runner. I also want to talk a little bit about another Sierra title that no one seems to remember called Stay Tuned, which is a pun on the word cartoon, by the way. I was planning to include that one here, but I'm going to save it for our next episode so we can give it and these other lesser-known titles the attention they deserve. Being the 1990s, there were plenty of other adventure game developers of note, so after we're done with Sierra, I'll talk a little bit about what Steve Moretsky was up to at Legend Entertainment and Bafo Games, making games like Spellcasting and The Space Bar, and we also need to talk about the efforts of developers and publishers like Westwood Associates, Interplay, Adeline Software International, Humongous Games, Activision, Revolution Software, Cryo, Perfect Entertainment, and Microprose. And of course, we have an obligation to accept Douglas Adams' invitation to take a trip on the Starship Titanic. And then we'll turn our focus to the multimedia era of the mid to late 1990s and the transition to FMV and full 3D adventures in the declining days of the genre, covering titles like Myst, The Longest Journey, Burn Cycle, Chronomaster, The Journeyman Project, The Seventh Guest, Blade Runner, The Last Express, Sanitarium, and The Neverhood. Finally, we'll close by touching on the 21st century contributions of studios like Telltale Games, Double Fine, Daedalic Entertainment, Amanita Designs, Wajidai Games, and Quantic Dream. We'll cover all of that and more in our next few episodes. If you enjoy this show, you can read this series every week on my Substack at greatestgames.substack.com, where you'll find brand new articles on other great games you've never played. And you're always welcome to talk with me on BlueSky, especially on times like this when I have a cold and not much of a voice. I'm Sean Jordan. I am your great game guide, and I'll be back next week with more to explore. Before I let you go every week, I close out the show with a game I want you to try that's a little off the beaten path. This isn't sponsored content, and I don't have any financial stake in anything I recommend. These are games that I think are really good, but don't have as much exposure as some of the more popular ones. This week, I want to recommend The Trolley Solution, a goofy little point-and-click indie game by the developer By Dan Dans, which is based on the thought experiment originally proposed by Philippa Foot about whether or not you should pull a lever if a trolley is going to murder a bunch of people if you do nothing. Thanks to a great scene in the show, The Good Place, I feel like the idea is pretty well known today, but this game takes it a step further by not only adding in a total of 20 increasingly silly scenarios, but also adding in 20 strange mini-games and wild stuff like a dating simulator where you play as a Japanese schoolgirl who's fallen in love with a trolley. If you've ever wanted to do things like play a trolley-themed idle clicker, or play a literal on-rails shooter, or grind your way around a train track by treating the trolley like a skateboard, this is the game for you. The game's far more comedic than philosophical, and I like that there's even a meta gag that requires you to pull a metaphorical level to buy the DLC, which barely adds to the total cost of the game if you use Steam's bundle feature, by the way, to access a mini-game. The DLC provides some additional content as well, so it is worth the negligible cost, but I have to admire the idea for its comedic value and also for making the player truly put their money on the line. For $10 plus another $1 or so for the DLC, The Trolley Solution is a great experience for a few fun hours. I do recommend playing it with a mouse rather than a gamepad or touchscreen, particularly if you're going to play it on the Steam Deck, and it's a lot of fun to play with a group of people or to just laugh at all the silliness together, especially that dating sim, which even has multiple endings to enjoy. The Great Game Guide is a podcast written by me, Sean Jordan, and I also wrote the theme music. This is all 100% human-created content. I don't use AI for any part of my production. This episode is copyright 2026 by me, Sean J. Jordan, and you can find more details in the show notes and on my website at greatestgames.substack.com. And credit where it's due. Any games, artwork, sources, or additional music are the property of their respective owners, used under fair use guidelines and also noted in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know on Substack, BlueSky, or with a nice review. But I'd appreciate it even more if you'd share it with a like-minded friend. Thanks for listening!